Just get something. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. On this beautiful evening. Yeah, I was out on the golf course today and it was raining and perhaps that was something to do with the way I was playing, but it certainly brightened up. That's lovely. Welcome to this talk by Charlie Bell, who is sitting here in the front row. Whew. It's always the case with the speaker. Are they actually going to turn up? Yes, they are. Good. Yes. Charlie's going to be talking about psychiatry and prayer and disorder and sin. Sorry, I shouldn't have put the emphasis on sin. But it does seem a very interesting set of things to talk about and how you link them together, and Charlie will no doubt enlighten us. Charlie is a non-stipendiary priest in the Diocese of Southwark and a forensic psychiatrist. You probably ought to have a television series, hadn't you? He read medicine at Queen's College, Cambridge, undertaking a PhD in medical genetics. His theological research interests include the interface of science, medicine, and theology. He's published several books and articles, regularly reviews for Theology Journal, and has taught in both theological colleges and ministerial training on the medico-theological interface and liturgy. Wow. Charlie, come and talk to us.
Well, thanks very much. Well, thanks very much indeed. It's very nice to be here. I'm very grateful to have been invited, and I can't remember exactly when I was invited. I think it was a little while ago, and being asked what would my topic be. And so, as you may notice, it's quite a long, I was up there a minute ago, it's quite a long topic, because I thought there's lots of different things to talk about around psychiatry, prayer, sin, human agency, human responsibility, forensics, God, all of those things really could take the 45 minutes individually. So I hope tonight I'm going to give you, or this afternoon, I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavour of where some of my thinking goes around concepts of sin and culpability, criminal justice, the life of the mind, and so on. But I don't expect any of you necessarily to leave here with a systematic theology of sin and psychiatry, not least because I don't think there is one yet, and possibly, praise God, there might never be. So just to give the context of my ministry, and I think I'm going to call everything I do ministry to some degree. As has been said, I'm a priest in the Diocese of Southwark in a very diverse parish in South London. It's near, talking about the sports, it's near the Oval Cricket Ground, but not near enough for us to get free tickets. My colleagues at St Mark's get the free tickets. What can you do? But we are that part of London, and interestingly, a part of London where I previously practiced as a psychiatrist, so an area which I've kind of got to know from two different perspectives. And perhaps one of the greatest joys of being a psychiatrist and a priest in the community which I serve is that I've hopefully helped some people in that community who would never have gone near psychiatrists, go near psychiatrists and be less concerned by and suspicious of psychiatrists. And frankly, many of them would be right in being suspicious of at least engagement with psychiatrists in the area of South London because, of course, the link between the mental health services and police in South London and the problems between police and particularly black young men in South London creates a great challenge for psychiatrists to effectively integrate their practice with local communities. So that's been a kind of pleasure to occasionally turn up surprising people with a dog collar. at which point people realize that, well, I was going to say that the psychiatrist can't be all bad, although a dog collar does not, as everyone who's met a priest will know, does not necessarily indicate that a priest is all good, but at least there might be some murkiness. And I want to talk about the murkiness of where my theological thinking and exploration goes when we talk about sin and about human personhood. Because I think one of the things we are determined to do or focus on doing as people of faith or as theologians or however we might want to describe ourselves is that we want a really neatly packaged version that is applicable to all. So we want to come out with a really good piece of theological thinking, which you can almost put into a machine and then press go and then sort of input the person in front of you and then hope that that will give you an answer. And of course, we know it doesn't work. But yet we seem to be increasingly tend to return to this idea of theology about the world as we wish it were. And the populations I work with are frequently, almost endlessly, remind me that that's not the case. So I work at the moment in a young offenders institution in a place called HMP ISIS, an unfortunately named institution, on the south bank of the River Thames. And prior to that, and again in a few months' time, I'm a consultant at Broadmoor Hospital, which is the hospital that incarcerates or treats or both a large number of the most risky individuals with mental illness and a criminal justice background in the country. And so that's my day job. So the most people I meet are people who have done things that most people will never have met someone having done. And I have to remember that when I go to dinner parties, because it's very easy to sit next to someone at dinner and discuss your work, albeit with patient confidentiality in mind, and realize that the person next to you has gone from being very green to being very pale, and then having to hold up the table in order not to pass out, and realize that, that what might be normal for a forensic psychiatrist working in high secure services is not necessarily normal for anyone normal. So that's the world in which I live. And I want to start by giving you a very brief case study of a patient that I did some family therapy with. And family therapy, the purpose of family therapy is essentially to try and understand and then to do something of the healing work of relationships or the relating between different members of that family unit. And there are lots of different ways of doing family therapy. We can do family therapy through structural family therapy or systemic family therapy or whatever else, but we're not going to care about any of that today. And I can hear my psychology colleagues in my ear telling me off for that. But let's just imagine this family. So I had a young man under my care who had killed his mother. And his mother and he were very close. And his mother was survived by 3 sisters. Dad was not on the scene, and there were no siblings. And this young man had come into our care and had been found by the court system to have diminished responsibility in the event, in the incident, or what we in the trade call the index offence. So he had been found to have limited responsibility. That is, he did it, but his state of mind at the time was such that he would not be found guilty of murder. And murder, for those of you, to be very blunt about it, murder, essentially you need to have both intention and responsibility. And if you can't prove that, then you can't be found guilty of murder. And it's never the benefit of the Crown Prosecution Service to go and find you or attempt to find you guilty, because it'll be thrown out and they'll get nothing. So this young man and he was young, in my care he was in his early 20s, and he'd been in services for quite some time, had suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia being a condition which is a sort of long-standing psychotic illness, and a psychotic illness being something where you have 3 general symptoms, one of which is you see or hear things that other people can't see or hear, so hallucinations. And the science behind hallucinations is fascinating. You can actually see on some brain scanning, people are actually hearing the thing, even though you can't identify the stimulus for them hearing it. So it's not as though someone is saying to you that I can hear something in a way which the rest of us would not be able to say. It's exactly the same process, but somehow it's awry in the way that it's triggered. So people have hallucinations. Typically, if you watch your films, the hallucinations will be seeing people. Very rare. You're much more likely to have auditory hallucinations, voices, or things like tactile or olfactory, so you smell things that other people can't smell or feel things that other people can't feel. So he'd had hallucinations. He's had something that we would call delusions, which lots of people, we all have delusions, all of us. My students always get very upset when I tell them that, but it is true. And it's not just the good delusions about thinking how marvelous we are, although all of us slightly think that. But it's delusions, for example, when I've given a lecture, when I leave the room, the first thing I think that my students are talking about on their way downstairs is how bad the lecture was. Now, they may well be thinking that, but that becomes a sort of thought that returns. And it's a thought that is probably falsifiable, but I don't want to necessarily falsify it. And even if I did falsify it, I would then say the next time, well, they might not have been doing it last time, but they're probably doing it this time. And delusion is essentially this idea that becomes so overpowering or so important and fundamental to your understanding of who you are and the way you engage with the environment that you are unable to see it as not being true. Everything else has to fit around it. And the delusion is true, everything else is untrue, or rather has to be malleable. And the final thing in a psychotic illness would be someone who has something we call thought disorder. So people's thoughts, they might have odd content, but they might also present themselves as thinking in a way which would be very unusual. So they might not be able to answer particular questions. They might answer questions very bizarrely, whatever it might be. So this chap had a bona fide diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, and he had thought that he was at great risk from his mother, who he didn't believe was his mother at that moment, and therefore felt that he was acting in self-defense, and that if he didn't kill her first, she would kill him. So acting out of great fear, out of great anxiety about being in the building with his mother at that particular moment. Wasn't sure that it was his mother. And had done this, and after the event had tried to run away, feeling that the police were also part of a wider conspiracy against him, and so on and so forth. Now, in the initial stages, the family were quite supportive, albeit shocked and horrified by what had occurred, but had tried to kind of understand what had happened. And then they found out that this young man had been smoking cannabis, and that the cannabis had been one of the triggers for the development of the psychotic illness. And so the family had immediately distanced themselves from this young man and had no longer wanted to have anything to do with him, saying, it is your fault that you became unwell, and if you hadn't smoked cannabis, then you wouldn't have done this thing. Now, what we knew was that this young man's mother had been buying the cannabis for the young man. And she'd not been buying it because she was an uncaring mother or whatever else, but because she saw that he was going through levels of stress, and that she knew that cannabis was something which helped him with the stress which he was having. So she felt that this was probably the best thing that she could do, was to give him something that would make him less stressed. And this was in a family who had experienced police brutality historically, and therefore were very suspicious of psychiatric services, and indeed of the medical profession more widely, and had some unusual beliefs perhaps about medicine, although not unusual within the group of people that they were associating with. So we brought all of this into the room, and we brought in this young man's 3 aunts. And the thing which we eventually were able to peel apart is that no one really knew who or what to blame. Everybody knew that someone or something should be to blame. Everyone was mourning the same event, and nobody knew how to talk to one another about it. Now, all of that is an excellent thing for my psychology colleagues to manage, which they did extremely well, and got to the place where misunderstandings and so on about mental illness could come out. But actually, looking in on it as a pastor or as a sort of theologian, looking in and saying, well, what is going on in that situation? And how do we think about the concept not just of blame, and blame, of course, under the criminal law is pretty simple. Either you did it or you didn't, and this is your sentence based on the badness of you having done it. What about blame and culpability from a theological perspective? In other words, what would God have to say about what occurred? And what would God have to say about all the different complex elements that fit into what occurred? And just as importantly, what do we do, and I'm thinking of we in that context as pastors or as people providing some level of pastoral care, what do we do when faced with the level of complexity in that case? And so I've delved for a long time into trying to work out how we understand sin on an individual rather than on a simplistic one-size-fits-all basis. Does, for example, someone sin less if they are prone to doing a particular thing? I'll give you another example to illustrate it. I had a patient, and this is actually a melange of different patients in order to keep some level of confidentiality to the cases because these are rarer. I have a patient who really, really liked hurting his sister. Really enjoyed it. Through his childhood, he'd really enjoyed hurting animals. Really enjoyed it. And had enjoyed setting fires. So the most excitement that he got was through setting fires. He actually got aroused by setting fires. That was one of the key diagnostic criteria for him. And he liked hurting his sister. He really liked hurting, and he really, really liked getting people close to him in order to somehow form a broken relationship with them. And the breaking of that relationship and the return and then the re-breaking of that relationship was beyond satisfying to him. And it wasn't just satisfying. It wasn't just something that he kind of did and didn't feel bad about. This was the only way, when we talked to him after a bigger event, when we talked to him, this was where he got his joy from. And it wasn't just happiness. It wasn't just that he felt happy in the moment. He felt fulfilled, and he felt a sense of peace and calm when he was doing this. And there was nothing else that he could identify in which where he could enjoy himself or where he could feel joy. And I'm using joy deliberately because it's often a sort of theological, we often compare optimism to hope and happiness to joy. I would say the way he described joy was as theological as anyone else had ever described joy to me. It was just that the source of it was horrifying. And he probably fit into this group that we would describe as psychopaths. People who lack the effective empathy to such a degree that they are unable to identify with the person in front of them. And often they have such a level of impulsivity that they can't stop themselves from doing the things that most of us would stop ourselves from doing. Good example of that is, if any of you have ever been on the edge of a pier or been up a high tower, almost everybody has the urge to jump, and almost everybody has the urge not to do it, or the lack of impulsivity, or even rather than a lack, an active stoppage of doing that. And so you might think in that case, that drive, that impulsive drive is so strong in individuals that have this particular set of traits, not sure if it's a condition or a set of traits, that they simply go ahead and do it. So this chap was probably a psychopath. Lack of effective empathy and lack of impulse control. He also had a horrendous history. Now, of course, it's true, not everybody with a horrendous history goes on to do horrendous things. That's certainly true, which makes the whole thing more complex. But he's had a horrendous history, and many of the things which happened in his childhood were easily linked to what was now occurring. We think probably that people in that situation are telling the truth when they talk about joy. So we think that that probably is true, that the only time where joy is experienced is when they're doing the thing which is problematic to the rest of us. And often, again, forgive the psychiatrist in me, I'm used to writing legal reports. The word problematic has rather greater emphasis than it does when spoken like that. But, horrifying, terrible things. And this is the kind of person that many people, including in the media, would describe as evil. And it's interesting, I think we've moved in our media discourse away from evil acts to evil people. I think it's been quite interesting in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, an increasing focus on the idea that a person is evil rather than that the act that they undertake is evil. And I mean, I think that's saying something fundamentally different. I think an evil act is a more understandable theological idea than an evil person. We'll return to that in a moment. But when I met this chap, the overarching feeling I had for him was of great sympathy. Not ignoring the horrors that had occurred, not minimizing them, but realizing that in front of me was someone whose mental disorder, or rather his neurobiology perhaps, or his psychology, or however we might want to describe it, and we can describe the same thing from different directions, was so disordered that this was the only way that pleasure or joy could enter his life. That actually the idea of him not doing these things and living with misery or a lack of joy felt to me also to be almost an unconscionable outcome for him. So he's in a position where if he does the thing which brings him joy, he does great damage in his social relating. And if he doesn't do this thing, he does great damage to his internal relating. How is a person such as that supposed to inhabit society? Well, we are very clear. We have a law. The person abides by the law, and if they don't abide by the law, they go to prison. And if they don't abide by the law in prison, which most psychopaths don't, because prison is boring, and there's loads of really easy places to attack people, or to take hostages, or to do other things which might bring a level of thrill. If we as individuals are unable to get any joy beyond doing that, the law will lock you up. And that will be the end of it, pretty much, until you get old. It seems that psychopathy kind of burns off the older you get, which I think is probably a good thing, although it then makes one wonder how many psychopaths walk around. And of course, many psychopaths find nicely psychopathic things to do with their psychopathy, which does not lead to obvious damage to others. It leads to lots of damage to others, often wakes of broken relationships. Friendships, romantic relationships, often great trails of destruction in professional lives, and so on. But they don't end up in prison because they are often able to find ways of doing things which give them joy, which is not that. But what do we say about such a person from God's perspective? If someone's psychology really is developed and disordered to the degree that is the only way that pleasure comes, what can we say about them and their culpability for their acts from God's perspective? And I think the easiest answer is always to reach for the fall. Everyone loves to reach for the fall. So if in doubt, go back to Genesis, the Christian reading of Genesis. The things we don't like, we blame on the fall. And there's so many different things that have been blamed on the idea that Adam and Eve and then Adam sinned, that therefore it must be the fall. But I don't think that does enough justice to the fact that individuals are affected in such different ways by whatever this mythical idea of the fall is. And most of us wouldn't talk about the fall as being a historical event. We would talk about it as being a way of explaining what has occurred, or perhaps a series of historical events, or whatever we might want to say. But if we're always going back to the fall as the thing that explains what we don't like, I'm not sure we're doing justice to the experience of individuals. So if someone's psychopathy, for example, is driven by their childhood experiences, who takes the blame from a theological culpability perspective? And for those of us who are in traditions which would sign up to the idea of hell, and I know probably not all of us are, and I'm not sure I am. I think I'm of the sort of theologian that hopes there isn't one, but thinks there could be, but thinks there probably isn't, but there might be. That's where I kind of sit with the whole discussions around that. But if we imagine, for argument's sake, that there is a hell, Or there is a purgatory where sins will need to be atoned for, or where you'll be purified, or however we want to think about it. Who is it whose sins are going to be atoned for in there? Is it the people who abused this individual? Is it the person who saw them as a vulnerable person and made use of them as a drugs mule and then got them hooked on drugs? Is it the person who didn't? Is it the parent? And we've been seeing this most recently in the last week with blame being placed on the parents of the Southport killer. Is it the parents who are held responsible for this? Is it the doctors whose sin has not led to... Is it the cultural milieu in which people... And so on and so forth. Or is it the person? Are people's psychology so damaged and deteriorated, and we really don't think we can bring people away from a very deep-seated psychological makeup, certainly in older adulthood. If that's the case, are we therefore writing people off? And if we're not writing people off, what do we do with the fact that we might say that the sins which they're doing or that they're undertaking would be unacceptable in any other circumstance where there was not a kind of mitigating factor? So does God, like the court system, permit aggravating and mitigating factors? If so, why? If not, why not? The courts, of course, admit mental illness and personality disorder as factors in sentencing. So if you were under the influence of a mental disorder at the time of committing your crime, that will likely be seen as some level of mitigation of what has occurred. If, however, you have a personality disorder, the courts will generally see this as an aggravating factor, because they will say your personality was so structured that your risk to others will remain elevated compared to the general population, and therefore we need to take greater action in order to keep the public safe. I'm not sure that's how God would think about it. Or rather, if God thinks. I mean, we can get into... It's impossible to talk about God, right? So theology is always not quite saying something about God. But if that's what God... If that's a theological understanding, that we say that people's personality as they develop becomes a kind of aggravating factor in their theological culpability, I struggle with that. But we meet this in our day-to-day life, so it's not only in forensic patients that we might meet this. So we will often have people, and we'll have people in our own lives, whether we admit to it or not, or we will have done, whose relationships are utterly chaotic. They're relating to us is probably chaotic. We all have these people. It might be us. But people who are impulsive or who are often hostile, often destructive, hurting others and hurting themselves. And what you want to kind of ask is, why do you keep doing this? What is behind what you're doing? Why can't you change? It's the thing humans believe. What is that? I can never remember who said it, but the thing that, the definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again and hoping for a different outcome. But that might be madness, but that's the human condition. It's what we endlessly believe about people. And in a sense, dare I say, it's the Christian position. It's the idea of forgiveness. It's the idea of, well, I know you've done this 30 times. How many times shall I forgive, Master? 7 times? 7 times 7. Which doesn't mean 49, obviously. But we, in a sense, theologically, we get to the place where we do imagine that there can be some kind of change in someone's relating, which then often turns in, certainly in church cultures or some church cultures so have you prayed about it? Have you prayed about changing? And is your destructive set of behaviors an example of sin? And when we start to talk about sin, we start to talk about responsibility and blame. So does the person in front of us have responsibility for what they've done? And what kind of responsibility might that be? And the problem is, I think we've inherited 2 kind of slightly different but interrelated languages. We've inherited the theological language, or the moral language, so sin, responsibility, repentance, virtue, and so on. And then we've inherited a medical language of disorder and diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. And we will often seamlessly switch between the 2 of them. And we will also often try and use one of those languages in particular circumstances, which might be an important thing to think about, but which might not be the most helpful language in that particular moment. And yet we can't get away from the idea that the theological vision for the human person is holistic. So the theological vision doesn't essentially say if someone is mentally unwell or has a personality disorder, they've got an opt-out. It means, so there's got to be something about the theological vision that encompasses everybody, but which perhaps has a level of nuance around what we mean when we talk about suffering or about disorder. And I don't think we've yet learned how to join those languages or how to speak with both of those languages effectively or how to understand those two languages together. Because they're both trying to describe a human person who is in distress in some form, and remembering that most people with psychiatric illnesses are much more fearful and distressed than the people who come into contact with them. But actually, a human person in distress who is acting in ways that are damaging to themselves and other people. Both of those things are trying to describe that person. And it's easy then to either moralize illness or to try and medicalize a moral struggle. And as a medical priest, I am endlessly finding myself doing both of those things. And I find this in the confession. My parish has a tradition of confession. The joyous thing about confession is you realize how holy your congregation are, because they confess things which I would never even bother to confess. And and I'm sitting there with this purple stole listening, and people are saying very honestly good, and I think, gosh, I wish I had the kind of holiness of living that you have, that I would even think to bring this up. But in confession, it's very easy to psychologize as a psychiatrist, and it's very easy to moralize in the context of psychiatric practice. And so I think what psychiatry does is complicates our notion of sin, and that theology deepens what we mean when we talk about disorder, appreciating that some people find the very idea of disorder, as offensive. And we can maybe talk about that during the questions. But what we essentially have, I think, in these two different models is two different models of anthropology, two different models of the human person. And we recognize that human beings are, in both cases, shaped and modeled by genetics and experience. And of course, the nature-nurture thing is not as clear-cut as was historically thought, and a lot of nurture is encoded in the way that your genes are expressed. But also embedded in culture, so the idea of the mind not stopping in the brain. And we know that there is no pure self that is untouched by the context in which we live. And hence, psychology in many ways is trying to make sense of an intangible to try and make it tangible enough to treat it. And indeed, I mean, we could talk about the failures of psychiatry. I could talk about them all day long. But psychiatry, in a sense, is trying to do the same, but pretending that we know what's going on with neurobiology at the same time. But theology then comes to us and says, well, yes, all of that is true, but we also, and Christian theology would say, yes, all of that is true, but we also are created in the image of God. We tend towards relationship. We're called into this thing called holiness, whatever that means, and we're sitting within a narrative of creation, redemption, and the fall in the middle. So creation and the fall. And so what is that image of God? What do we mean by the image of God? Is it something that we are, or is it something that we do, or is it something that we become in relationship? And all of these things have sat through the theological literature for years and years, where people are trying to describe what those few verses, and there's more than one, there's a number of verses that speak about the image of God, particularly in the first few chapters of the Bible, of Genesis, sorry. When we think about the image and likeness of God, what is it? Is it what we are or what we do? And how does that then impact on how we engage with human beings as biological creatures? Is the human person divisible into soul and body? And how about spirit? Where does all of this sit? And if the human body is somehow divisible, or if we think there is such a thing definable as the soul, what do we mean? And I think this is particularly important. There's a great book by John Swinson, who is a lecturer in ethics and pastoral and practical theology, and think it's Aberdeen. I can't remember. Anyway, is it Aberdeen? Yes, okay. It's always good to quote one's sources correctly. But John writes brilliantly about dementia and about the idea. And he says, in dementia, we often hear the person has gone. But then what are we saying about the person in front of us? The real Jean has gone, for example. Well, is that might be helpful for us from a kind of societal or sociological perspective or even a biological perspective to describe. But is that a theologically useful statement? And what do we mean by the soul through all of this? So all of you will know, I'm sure, that none of you are as you were, and none of you are even molecularly as you were when you were born. So your molecules aren't the thing that holds you together, but you're still you. If we think about dementia, it's not just memory is often something that we think, and it's the kind of go-to thing that we describe as being the thing that holds you together. But if it's not memory, because there's still something of you, even when memories, and we know memories fade, or we have false memories. I have many false memories of doing well at university, but we all have false memories, and we hide behind, and that's what we think ourself is. We find ourselves found in our history, but of course we don't hold all the memories. Other people hold them as well, so it's contextual. But if we lay memory to one side, what is left? And I think the what that is left, or the you-ness of you that is left there, is what the biblical writers are getting to when they're speaking about the soul. But there's no room for the soul in conversations in psychiatry, or there's very rarely been room for the soul in conversations in psychiatry, because we'd be much more interested in thinking about what the biology, the biochemistry, the affective state, the personality formation, the affect, the way that we feel our emotions or our behaviors. So we have sort of affect, cognition, and behavior in the psychiatry world, and in theology world, we have intention, will, and freedom. And how do we hold those things together? And is there such a thing as freedom when we think of it from a biological question, back to our friend the psychopath? To what degree is there freedom? We all think we have freedom. We think we have freedom because mostly, we had a quick discussion before, actually most people find the idea of sin quite attractive, because sin is sort of associated with the fun things. But actually, most of the things which we feel ourselves tended towards, we don't massively dislike. I mean, I hate the gym, but kind of things like, doing good to others. We know that there's a sense of altruism that is encoded somehow in the way that we are as human beings. So it's kind of easy for us to be good. Not immensely easy, but easy enough. Because a lot of the things which we are directed towards are things that our religious tradition calls good. But if we don't have that, and we call that freedom, right? So we say that it's a freedom to follow the good, and we are being released to follow the things that we believe are good. But if the things that we felt were enjoyable or fun or joy-bringing were not good, to what degree does that impact on freedom? And to what degree can we truly call ourselves free if we are simply tending towards the good? It's a different notion of freedom, perhaps, than the American Constitution might want us to think, which is often, in the current world, a good thing, I think. So in other words, what if the capacity to choose the good is unequally distributed? And what if it is unequally distributed through mechanisms which are so complex that we may never be able to distinguish them? So we might want to point to genetics or environment or upbringing or context or whatever else, but what happens if it's simply impossible to draw those things apart? And what do we do with individuals? We can talk about structural sin and about the systemic sin and how sin runs through communities and how the sin of the fathers on the next generation or whatever else. And a lot of that we can see as being fundamentally true. If you grew up in an abusive household, it has an impact upon you and on your behavior pretty much consistently. So we can see that there is a level of structural or systemic sin in which these sins are found within the context or the community. But what about the individual? Because we do say that individuals matter. A sloppy way of thinking about that is when I've met clergy who have got to a point where they've told me that they would not baptize someone with a severe intellectual disability because they are not able to profess their faith, personal faith in Jesus Christ. Which, of course, and I'm glad that people are kind of saying that's horrifying. It's a conversation which I've had with actual living clergy. But I think that's, again, a reductive understanding. Firstly, it's a reductive understanding what it means to profess faith. But we make these kind of statements. We say, well, you can only be baptized if you are willing to make a statement of personal faith in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Well, let's be careful about being too absolutely definitive in those kind of conversations, because we might end up in a place where we imagine there to be an absolute when there isn't. Right, I will draw to a close because I can see the time drawing on. And I can see a face in the front giving me a clear discussion point to end. So, what do we do? So I think one answer is that we just retreat into moral clarity and insist that individuals have responsibility. So we say, all of those things that you said might be true. They're really rare. They are extreme examples to try and cause trouble, which I admit I enjoy doing. So therefore, we can ignore them. And actually, the responsibility remains, and well, God knows. And that's the kind of classic get out of jail free for any theologian. I know it's difficult, but God can deal with that. It's not for me to say, you know. The alternative is not to abandon the idea of sin, but to try and deepen it within the tradition. And so we could think, for example, about the fact that Augustine already talks about the fracture of our willingness. So, or the fact that our desires are intrinsically in some way disordered, and that this is simply a reflection of the disorder. Action doesn't follow intention. You can think of St. Paul here. You know, I do the things which I wish I did not do, and I don't do the things which I ought to do. But yet, Augustine holds on to the concept of grace through all of this. So Augustine imagines that even though you might find the most heinous offender, still the concept of grace must be applicable because Jesus Christ still died for this individual. But what does that mean within our ecclesial communities? And what does that mean when we're trying to provide some level of pastoral guidance or support to people who might find themselves in that particular environment? So I think to finish, we've landed in a place where moral responsibility, in my view, is to some degree conditioned by the context, conditioned by the environment, conditioned by one's own self, with all of the murky biological and other parts that sit within that. I think we also have to recognize that our moral responsibility is to some degree constrained. And it's not merely those people that have a constrained moral responsibility, but that each of us sits on some level, and we often think of it as a spectrum, but I prefer to think of it as a kind of multi-dimensional spectrum, because we're kind of constrained here, but we've got less constraint there, and all of us walk around with a level of constrained moral responsibility. And our moral responsibility is shaped by what we can both perceive, regulate, and sustain. And that latter part matters because then we can start talking in Christian terms about things like formation. We can start talking in Christian terms about being part of the communion of saints or the people of God, or however we might want to think about it. And pastoral care becomes increasingly about accompaniment and aiding in that formation away from moral judgment. And I think we are on the cusp of moving in that direction. But every time I think we're on the cusp of moving in that direction, I fear we jump back because we much prefer rules when it comes to moral responsibility than we do to the murkiness of having to address ancient concepts of sin, which, by the way, is not a single concept biblically anyway, but ancient concepts of sin with current and contemporary understandings of what it means to be, as much as we can understand, a human being fully embodied. So I'll stop there. I'm very happy for questions.
I won't take the thunder away from the vote of thanks at the end, but I've been sitting there, and yes, I did look at my watch, and I thought, 42, really? Wow, gosh. And I also had a picture of a kaleidoscope. You remember the old kaleidoscopes you used to have as children? You kept turning it. Gosh, it's another idea.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Another idea. Wow. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Thank you.
We'll do the thanks properly. So, questions, comments? 74 of you, yes. Let's start there.
Thank you, yes. Well, thanks a lot. That was all very interesting. I noticed that you drew attention to the tension between what you call the medical language of disorder on the one hand and theological languages of sin and redemption. That's not a nice place to be in, really. But, and I can see if you work with offenders in the way that you do, that you might be drawn to that. I wanted to ask you about Alfred Adler. I mean, it's very easy, especially if you're working in the context that you're working in, to drown, in crude Freudian, I'm sure you don't do it, but some do, rather crude Freudian notions of chaos in the deep subconscious. Well, Jung took us out of that, but I mean, he lived such a life of holiness that I think most of us can't aspire to that. Adler, I think, is rather neglected, and I wonder what you think about Adlerians who, on the whole, believe that one can, with some sort of effort, emerge from that, the tyranny of the deep subconscious, and create a very promising future, very future-oriented. And it sometimes describes the will to power. I don't think that describes Adler, actually. It's much more optimistic than that.
Yes, so I think one of the great challenges with the so Adler and, the name's going to escape from my head just as I was thinking it, German psychologist during the war, Viktor Frankl, sorry. Substantively different psychologies, but nonetheless, both of which suggest some way of moving out of the mess into, and being almost drawn to, rather than pushed from, but almost being drawn towards something. And I think for the vast majority of people, psychological theories that address, or that are directed at sort of goals or formation in a kind of psychological sense. So sort of being able to be either recreated or to be developed in one's psyche, that moves beyond the kind of primal urge stuff to being more formed as human beings. I think in 90% of cases, or who knows, random percentage, high percentage, are really very helpful. I think the challenge with psychological therapies is that they don't necessarily address anything that's true, in that they seek to give a framework to understand the experienced human person, or the kind of the human person as experienced. But we can't ever know whether they're actually true. And I think most psychologists, including Frankl and probably Adler, although I don't know, would probably admit to that. And would say, actually, what we're trying to do is create a framework which is useful. And much of the psychology which I use on people, with people, is about the stuff that works, and about the thing and the reason that so many of these psychological theories have grown great disciples is that they work for a large number of people. They help explain things. They provide a great framework for the explanation. And Viktor Frankl's another good example whereby the idea that man's search for meaning, so the thing that gets you through is that everyone is free to develop their own sense of meaning, and their own, they will design their own sense of meaning in the particular environment. And it's those who can find meaning that survive, and those who can't that don't. There's criticisms of that method or idea, but all of these, I think, kind of point to some of the things which do seem to be the case in the vast majority of human beings. My problem is that in people whose psyche, for want of a better word, because of course I'm now talking about something that isn't real, but someone's sense of themselves may be so fixed that the idea of being able to climb out of it or climb towards something else may no longer be possible. And it's those people that I then get tricksy about, but also the difficulty being that theology is kind of doing the same. I mean, theologians and psychologists are always slightly sort of dubious of one another, I think, except for psychological theology, apart from those who are in both camps. But there is always a bit of a sort of, aren't you trying to do what we're doing? And psychologists, of course, would say, yes, you're trying to do it, and then for all the problems that we encounter, you just invent God. And there's not too unfair an argument. But I do think there is something about our theologies sometimes fall into the same bucket as some of these very positive or some of these very positive psychologies, which suggests that therefore the person should change or be formed or whatever, if only. And I think we should be wary of that from a theological perspective, even if it's helpful from a psychological.
Thank you. As I tried to understand much of what you said, the one thought that constantly seemed to just be bouncing around in my mind was somewhere in the New Testament, I think, Jesus is described as fully human, but without sin. And if sin is disorder, I wonder if you could, is that from a psychiatric or a theologian? Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the difficulty with the word disorder in psychiatry is that it's both overused and understood. And is that a word? Well, it is now. So disorder, a personality disorder, for example, would simply be where someone's functioning, social functioning, and that can be within oneself or out with others, is so far from what would be considered normal bounds as to be having a significant impact upon their function. So it's actually a descriptive term rather than it's not a kind of ontological term. It's not trying to describe something of the individual. But it's a description about how someone is behaving, particularly. And so I think some of the concepts around disorder in science or in mental health conversation will remain at the level of description, whereas I think some of the conversations about disorder, particularly reading through things like the Catechism of the Catholic Church and various other places where you find the word disorder is being used in a slightly different way, which is where it's being used as an ontological term. So it's actually describing that there's something about the person's personhood which is somehow awry. And I think that's basically, I think that follows from the fall. And the idea that everybody's, and you think about the way that Augustine plays with this, but thinking about the kind of disordered will, disordered desires, the lack of total freedom, these kind of things, those stem from an actual and real problem with the human person, which of course you get into the interesting conversations about the image of God in the human person, and it does actually feature in the scriptures after the fall, but no one likes to mention that. However, when you then get to Jesus, so there's that terribly misquoted, I've actually just been given, I was in the States last week, and I was given a very, very lovely picture to put on my wall, which had the misquoted Irenaeus, which said the glory of God as a human being fully alive. That's not actually what it says. It's actually talking about Jesus Christ. The glory of God is essentially referring to Jesus Christ, rather than the idea that if a human being's fully alive, then God's really joyous about it, which is a shame, because that's a lovely thought, but it's not what he said, but it's on my wall now. But actually, if we look at when we think about the kind of the Christ event and so on, what we don't end up with Jesus is someone who does not have emotions, or does not have cognition, or who does not have behavior or temperament or personality or whatever else. And so when we start to think about the kind of perfect human, fully, I prefer the language of fully rather than perfect, but the language of fully human, fully God, what do we mean by the fully human? Ontologically, I think, is the interesting and important thing there. What is it about the person of Jesus that we can say shines out the fullness of the fullness? And then we get to sin, and he was, entirely like us, yet without sin. And I think that is a very complicated problem, because if we understand sin, for example, particularly the way that a number of contemporary theologians do, where it's kind of sticky, so it's in the environment, it's in the context, it's in the structures, it's in all of that kind of stuff. What do we mean when we say Jesus is without sin? Do we mean that this sin doesn't affect Jesus, or do we mean that Jesus is somehow able to rise above the sin that is sticky in the environment, or do we mean that Jesus is without personal sin? Jesus, of course, is on occasion just a touch rude, or at least the gospel writers present us with a Jesus who is on occasion just a touch rude, which I think my mother, when I was a child, would have told me was very sinful. So that I think it's important. So what do we mean when we say without? Or what does it's Paul, isn't it, that says this? Is it Hebrews? Is it Hebrews? So it's definitely not Paul, despite one of my undergrads consistently telling me that it is Paul. But what does the writer of Hebrews then mean by that? What does the without bit mean? And I think that, and that then, the reason I probably can't give you a specific answer is because that's the problem. But perhaps that's a good place to start, which is, as always with all Christian theology, a good place to start is the person of Jesus Christ. So what is the fully humanness of Jesus Christ during his reported lifetime, and how might we somehow be formed like that or into that?
To return to your friend, the young man, who was hearing voices, and you did that experiment which showed that he was hearing them, but that there was no outside stimulus. Has anybody tried to do that with people who have a mystical experience, which is a sense of union with God? Has any neurological experiment been done to see whether that also is self-generated? And if it were self-generated, would that prove that God did not exist? Or would it, in fact, just be one of the mysteries of God? Would it make the experience more or less precious?
Okay, so I don't actually know. I presume probably there has been some experiments. But other people might know. There probably have been, but they've probably been on such a small scale that they're completely irrelevant to the answer to the rest of your point. Because you can prove anything with a sample size of one. And also, if someone's having a mystical experience at the time whereby they go into the MRI scanner, there's also questions to be asked. But anyway, the substantive question underneath is, I think, one of the ones which I've grappled with quite a lot. It was one of the first questions I was ever asked as a medical student, which was about, I was just said, you surely can't believe in miracles. You're a scientist, you can't believe in miracles. And I kind of thought, well, I believe in the resurrection. So if I believe in the resurrection, the miracles are small fry. They're this is nothing. I think Jesus can kind of do whatever. If we believe that someone literally rose from that, that's the really bizarre thing. The miracles are nothing. But in a sense, that brings me back to the whole concept of how we think God interacts with the world. So we often think of things as being spiritual as opposed to other things. So, I've written in a book about Cicely Saunders, the founder of the hospice movement. And I think one of the things which she helpfully does is move away from the idea of you having biological, psychological, social, and spiritual to the idea that the spiritual is actually just a description of your entire holistic existence. And so we're not, and I think we've often mistaken spiritual for metaphysical, i.e. something that we can't explain, so it must be God, my unfair description of metaphysics. But actually, does it matter, is one of the questions that I would ask. So does it matter whether we can find it on an MRI scanner or not? And if we can, does that answer whether or not it's of God? And I'm not sure it does, because I don't think, I think God, so Jesus was a man, right? As far as we know, but Jesus was a human being. So God makes use of the things of human stuff in order to be the truest revelation. So therefore, in a sense, it wouldn't worry me if God was was using the brain for a mystical experience. I'm often asked in my clinical practice, is this a bona fide mystical experience? Or is this a bona fide, could this person hearing voices, or could this be a mystical experience? It's the thing that many of my Pentecostal friends get very upset with me about, because they think I'm terribly reductive. And I usually say in those cases, firstly, what's the impact on the individual? What do we mean by spiritual in that case? What's the impact on the individual? I don't know if it's metaphysical or not. Might be, might not be. And also, what is the thing doing? So most cases I can tell when someone's having a psychotic episode related to religious beliefs, because the Archangel Gabriel tells them to go and throw a woman under a bus. The Archangel Gabriel generally isn't into violence. Well, actually, but isn't into bad violence, right? So it's quite easy, I think, to determine when something seems to be related to an underlying illness than when something appears to be an experience which somehow is meaningful to the individual in front of us. None of that proves whether God is or is not involved, but there's quite a large part of me that's not worried about whether God is or is not involved, because whether it's a metaphysical event, God probably is still involved because it's someone somehow having an experience which relates to their underlying kind of religious identity and spiritual, and their spiritual sense of self. So I think it's a helpful thing to explore, but I don't think we're ever going to have the answer to it. Like if we found a God region in the brain, all that tells us is that humans are meant to experience God. Well, so that could mean that God definitely exists and has given us the ability to experience God, or God doesn't exist and it's a load of nonsense. But it doesn't answer which one of those it is.
Canterbury in 2003. I'd been offered a job at Ashworth as chaplain. And one of the reasons I didn't go there was because they had decided to ward the hospital into either psychiatric patients or mental disorders. Yeah. And I didn't like that idea. Do you distinguish between psychiatric and personality disorder?
So Ashworth is another one of the high secure hospitals in the country. We go through cycles of being the most awful. It's not us at the moment. I think it's Ashworth, but it might be Rampton. But there's three of us, and we go through the cycle endlessly of being told we're unacceptable. Now, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I've literally spent the last 2 months of my life in consultants' meetings at one another's throats about exactly this question. Is there such a and our question has not been so much, is there a distinction between personality disorder and mental disorder, i.e. mental disorders being things which seem to primarily relate to experiences, whereas personality primarily relates to the personality. But we've been arguing exactly this. Should we have separate services or should we be integrated? And we've ended up being integrated. And I think there is something distinct about personality disorders in the impact that they have on individuals, but I don't think that there is anything distinct about the symptoms per se. So I think that, and I also don't think that there is a neat distinction between people who do and do not have diagnosable mental health disorder or personality disorder. I think all of this, and I think if you read the most recent statistical manual, the ICD-11, we've moved away from the idea of having discrete personality disorders towards the idea of there's all these traits that people have, and they all contribute, and in some people this will impact their function to such a degree that we would say that there's a disorder, and the purpose of knowing there's a disorder is to help someone understand themselves better. But some of those traits are things like paranoia. Well, paranoia is found in schizophrenia, or in some forms of schizophrenia, or there might be impulsivity or anxiety. Well, you can find that within anxiety disorders. And so I think it's much more that these things are part of the way that our brain seems to function, either under normal conditions or under conditions of stress, that we have endlessly wanted to categorize because we want psychiatry to be like having a broken leg. So if you have a broken leg, you know what to do with it. So at the moment, if someone comes in to me with paranoid schizophrenia, I know which medication to give. Or schizoaffective disorder, or whatever else. The reality is it's far messier than that. And we give people a diagnosis because it helps us medically in terms of treatment most of the time. But whether it actually helps describe the truth or whether it actually helps the individual, I think is a much wider question. And I have frankly found having mixed wards being much happier for those individuals because they are not firstly labelled as being either this or that, but also their symptoms are not seen as the only thing which defines them. And that is something which we really suffer from in mental health hospitals. And that's something I'm afraid that some of my physical health colleagues also routinely do. We've moved a little bit away from the leg in bed 8. I mean, not completely, I have to say, for some of the people I've worked with, but the leg in bed 8. But we haven't moved away from the mental health patient in room 13. It's seen as an entirely separate thing. And I think that's very damaging and unhelpful, not least because we know of the link between physical and mental illness and disorder, which is so clear and is bidirectional. Yeah. I'm going to take that back to my colleagues and say I was asked about this, because this is something we've been obsessing about. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a fabulous lecture. There is a line that runs between the will and then sin and then judgment. And the will, of course, we always think of being under our own control. Some of the examples you gave suggest that's not the case. And there are more acquired stories that emphasize that. I mean, one of them is the side effect of an anti-Parkinson drug, which causes massive changes in behavior, including obsessive behavior, quite damaging.
Yeah.
Do you think that this sense of will is actually a useful delusion?
Well, yes, I mean, both of that. I think the Parkinson drug is a great example, because it shows a very particular part of an individual which is changing often fundamentally to what the individual would have been like previously. And you see the same often in Alzheimer's, where individuals who were previously very gentle might become more violent, or who, like my grandmother, are rather grumpy and doesn't really like talking to people, suddenly are sitting there opening a bottle of Prosecco and inviting you to have Prosecco and biscuits, which was an extremely bizarre experience for me. We see this kind of, we see writ large the fact that there is some level of a containment of freedom, or a containment of the will. And of course you have the theologians particularly during the Reformation period, arguing endlessly about this. So we end up with the kind of the logical outcome being double predestination and so on, and that actually it's got nothing to do with you. And then Arminianism, so you have to kind of work alongside God and hand yourself, but that grace does the thing, but you have to be open to it. And then and Calvinists being a bit further towards it's only the grace that does it, and you don't have any role in it. And so this debate goes on endlessly in the theological literature. So there's not one theological perspective on it. But I think we do see that there are situations in which the will is genuinely curtailed and can be curtailed medically. I mean, that's, the Parkinson drug is a good example. We stick chemicals into somebody and they do something to that person. And they do something to something which we have, I guess, imagined to be immutable. Particularly the personality. So I still peddle the line that most people with personality disorder in their 30s, so it moves every year, but it used to be that your brain was sorted when you were 21, and then it was 25, and then it's 30, But most people in their 40s with a personality disorder, I would usually say to them, it's unlikely that we're able to change your personality structure. But here are some coping mechanisms to live with the personality structure that you currently inhabit. Except if we whack them full of dopamine antagonists or something, we can see their changes occurring in their personality structure. Except then when we take those away, then the personality structure generally returns back to the way it was. So what does will mean in that circumstance? And then where does culpability fit into all of that? I found that, you probably have heard it, the Radio 4 documentary on the use of these new anti-Parkinson's drugs that led to sort of excess and extreme sort of sexual inappropriateness. And hearing and it's such hearing some of the stories in them where, again, you've got the desperation for culpability and the desperation for blame that sits beneath, and if it's not them, then it's the companies, or it's it just highlights the complexity of the idea of willful and will in that context. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating example.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I really enjoyed what you said. I've worked in a similar area to you all my life. But I have to say, as I get old, having worked in psychiatry and in faith and in church and all the rest of it, I think possibly the best thing Jesus ever said was, judge not, lest you be judged. When you look at medical treatments, I kind of worked with ME, chronic fatigue, things like that. Loads of different suggestions work for different people, but none of them work for everyone. And it's almost And theologically, it seems exactly the same. Different religious suggestions work extremely well for some people, thoroughly and deeply annoy other people. And my personal feeling is that God has created an incredibly complex world. And our job is to try and act caringly in it and make it work better for all the people in it, rather than to come to conclusions about the existence of sin or anything else. And so I suppose my feeling, both in medical practice and in theological practice, has been almost don't judge, just try and think what might help this person or what might help the person who might be affected by this person's actions, and try and come up with the most compassionate solution.
Yeah, and I think probably the best example of compassionate accompaniment, which is how I'd kind of describe that, has been, I think I've seen it more clearly in my psychiatric world than in my church world. And that includes, and particularly my psychiatric nursing colleagues, actually, who bear the brunt. When something bad happens, I run. Not very effectively, but sort of not very fast, but nominally towards the door. I run away, my psychiatric nursing colleagues run towards. They're the ones who get assaulted, they're the ones who face the kind of hard edge of this stuff. And yet, so many of them genuinely are not judgmental. They might not like it, and it's not to take away from the horror of some of the things that people have experienced, but they really have led or got to a level of compassionate accompaniment. And the same is true of a number of my patients. I had a patient who really had a very nasty history in every possible way. And who was a bit of a grumpy old git, really. But in hospital, I'd been in hospital for ages and been very grumpy and very sort of not very engaged with people and didn't like spending time with people and so on. I can sometimes empathise with him, and however, he showed small but very noticeable moments of kindness to people. So new people on the ward that he thought were being targeted, he would be absolutely backing them up every time. It was often indistinguishable, but it was there. And when he died of natural causes in hospital. And I remember the email going around the staff letting people know that he died. Every single person said, "Rest in peace," all this kind of stuff. And it wasn't meant as a kind of flower. It was quite a religious group of people that worked in the institution. It was very clear that the reality of working alongside people for whom this stuff is complex rather than simple had led people to a much deeper understanding of the grace and mercy of God. And that for me is that, but the difficulty is then going back to church environments and I almost want all of my clergy colleagues to go and do I don't actually want them to do my psychiatric job for the sake of some of my patients, but I would quite like some of them to inhabit that environment for a bit. I think my theological thinking becomes much, much sharper from having not been able to have a simple answer to stuff. And I think that's true about most theological thinking. And I'm very grateful to my patients for that, because it's very easy to reach for the easy answer. But then I find myself reading Aquinas and thinking, well, maybe it's it, or maybe it's it. And again, the tendency for us to categorize is endless, and the need for us to always have that pulled back, I think, is key. Although, I know there's other questions, but one other thing I would say, though, is there is a challenge, though, when it comes to the impact on others, and how you can be both non-judgmental to the individual, but also not minimize the impact of these behaviors on other people. And that is really, for me, and I'm really at heart, very bleeding heart. I mean, I go in and I'm like, oh, well, it was only murder. That's really how I can't help myself. I have this kind of sort of appalling sense of being unable to be kind of grumpy with people about but actually, that's not an acceptable response either. And when I write my court reports, I'm meant to be doing justice to the situation in front of me, which can include compassion, but also requires you to recognize the impact of these things on other people. So you can be both compassionate to the individual in front of you, but also not allow that compassion to cloud the horrors that others might experience. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Now, time for 2 more questions. And I've already nodded at 2 people at the back there, so please be compassionate for me if you've been having your hand up and you're not going to be able to ask a question. The gentleman there, that's it, yes.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Although you've used extreme examples, it seems to me that pastorally, what you're talking about is something close to the bone for every one of us. So we agonize about whether something that we did wrong was us or whether it was the environment. And sometimes we can feel guilty for things that we shouldn't feel guilty for, and we can get all mixed up, and our conscience can get distorted. So we repent for the wrong things, let's say. Anyway, you can see that it's a murky area, and since you're also a confessor, you must have thought about this sort of pastoral side of it.
Yeah, so I think one of the great joys, so I'm a Church of England priest, one of the great joys of the Church of England's liturgy is that you have communal confession. So you actually confess, and it's almost like a catch-all. So it covers all bases, really. The problem with communal confession is that it can become very sloppy, and you don't then think through the sins. And I'm not a big fan of someone coming with a list of sins. And there's a friend of mine, a priest in the parish, who when he hears confession says, "Yes, I've heard all of those before. Any new sins, please?" Which I think is a rather good line. But there is a sense that we in not doing the moral and the kind of moral examination, we run the risk of not thinking through deeply those patterns of sin which do stick to us and so on. But the risk of the alternative of spending all your time worrying about, well, was it this, was it that also then almost becomes a bit of a kind of salvation through works, and the work is working out which sin you've committed. And so, like, as a good Anglican, I think there's a nice middle balance. But I do think there is, which is that I think things like now I'm going to use a non-Anglican example, but like the examen of the Jesuit tradition, actually of sitting down and really not necessarily sin hunting, but exploring one's day and behaviors and attitudes and aptitudes and so on, and really seriously paying attention to how you have related to yourself, to God, and to others, feels to me to be the kind of helpful way of doing that, without necessarily needing to come to an example, needing to come to a conclusion. And I'll often say to penitents, which always irritates them because they think if they just get it off their chest and it's done, but I'll often say things like, well, why are you bringing this? What is it? And sometimes that reveals that there's something else. Sometimes it reveals that actually the thing which they are most feeling guilty about is actually not a sin to be confessed. Sometimes it suggests that it is. And so sometimes it's that exploring with others in that context, which can be quite helpful. It's not for all, but for some people it can be. But I would definitely say approaching the idea of one's own sinfulness as a kind of examination of conscience, rather than as trying to identify and work out how grace is going to do the mechanics, feels to me to be the risk, and that we shouldn't do. Grace works. That's what we know about grace. Like we know God is. That's all we know about God.
Maybe briefly, because of time, thank you so much for your presentation. And from the hearing from, the introduction that was given, you are privileged to have, at least coming from the medical side, and at the same time, you are a theologian. I'd like you maybe briefly to distinguish the mental disorder from demon possession.
Yeah. So this is a really important question, and I don't think one that any mainstream church has necessarily landed on a final answer, and maybe there is no final answer. And I think it comes back a little bit to hearing voices. Is this a spiritual matter? Is this a metaphysical matter? What is going on? I have done a little bit of consulting for a diocese, which remain nameless for reasons, because we keep these things nameless, about in the context of perceived possession. So every diocese in the Church of England has a diocesan deliverance minister. Sorry, I'm not meant to call them exorcists anymore. Deliverance minister. There's a deliverance ministry team. There are lots of books written on this, most of which I find quite unconvincing, but that's probably just me. But there is the idea and the possibility of this remains present within most religious traditions, or within most Christian traditions, whether or not it is seen to be a kind of fundamental or major part of it. My point, I think the place I would usually land is that I'm never sure that I'm sure. But I am sure that what I would want to do is to I would not want someone to go untreated who could be treated and who could find release through medical means. At the same time, I wouldn't ever prevent someone from praying. What I probably would do is not pray myself in certain circumstances. There's a sort of tendency to say, well, if you just go and offer a prayer, it'll be fine. And the risk of offering a prayer, I know this from an example in the parish where someone thought that their house had an evil spirit in it, and it was pipes. It was pipes and poor hearing. It was very clearly that that's what it was. But this person was absolutely convinced, and I said, well, let's go and let's see if we can sort this out and so on. We can talk about it. We can talk about it prayerfully, but I'm not going to pray a prayer of deliverance willy-nilly. And unfortunately, not one of my colleagues, but someone else from another tradition did go and pray a prayer. And this then led to this person becoming absolutely convinced that this was indeed demon possession of the house. And I don't think it was. But I think in the pastoral response, what was seen as a pastoral response, actually pastoral damage had been done, which is why it's so complicated in those cases to know what you should do. I've got time to tell one silly story. So when I was in hospital and in the oncology ward, there was a chap who, and if you have something called COPD, if you have there's two forms. One of them, you need lower level of oxygen because it increases the drive for you to breathe, and because of the level of carbon dioxide and so on. And this individual required a lower level of oxygen than most of us would require. And he went down for a CT scan and came back. And the nurse at the end of the bed perfectly reasonably turned the oxygen on to full without checking on the sheet, and this person promptly became moribund. And so the alarm went off, and unfortunately at the same time this person's priest was there and was beginning to pray loudly with some gusto over the body. And I went, and this person was still alive, but only just, and I went and I turned the oxygen down. And of course this person got better and sat up, at which point there's praise Jesus, and so that is the risk. So of course, and that is the difficulty with all of this. Back a bit to the question about if we would know whether God existed or not, and so on. It is very, very hard, and it is a matter of some discernment. And I think discernment never happens individually; it always happens as a group. And in the Church of England, that would certainly be how it would happen in a discernment committee. Church of England has many committees; that's one of them. But I will not, because of having a Christian faith, I will not eliminate the possibility of that being the case. Because who am I to eliminate that possibility? And if you read St. Paul, his principalities and power stuff's pretty strong. But I also would not eliminate the possibility that I might be able to do something as a doctor. And I would never want to feel that I was not doing that if I felt there might be a possibility of it helping that individual.
Wow. Yes. I'm really sorry to those of you who wanted to ask questions, and there simply isn't the time. I think this has been an energetic, fizzy, buzzy meeting, and I'm delighted. I think we must think next time, Doreen, of residential meetings, so that everybody can ask the questions. But there's just time now for a very well-earned vote of thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Reverend Dr. Charlie, if I may address you in that form, for a very lively, but at the same time deeply thoughtful and challenging presentation. You've helped us see that conditions that we often try to separate, mental disorder, prayer and sin, are in fact intertwined with the lived experience of the whole person. This reminds us that human beings cannot be reduced to either diagnoses or to moral categories alone. In particular, your exploration of responsibility and culpability encourages us to approach others, and perhaps ourselves, with greater humility and compassion. Thank you again so much for helping us think more wisely and to care more deeply. Thank you.
Those of you who come regularly to these talks will know that we try to have as varied a programme as possible. Our next meeting is on Wednesday, the 20th of May, when George Conine, who used to teach American history at the University of Kent and is himself American, will be speaking on the subject, The Trump Political Earthquake and American Faith Communities. I think that may be very different from tonight.
There's some learning from tonight, though.
I mentioned last time that we're starting to plan a programme for next year. So if you have any ideas about possible speakers, please do let me know. And could the person who proposed Joanna MacDonald have a word with me, because we still haven't got the details straight for her. And then finally, my usual reminder, if you are not on our emailing list and want to receive our monthly reminder of meetings and next year's programme when it's completed, there is a piece of paper on the table in the foyer. Please put your name and your email address on it, but please write legibly. We'll look forward to seeing as many of you as possible on the 20th of May.